It's time for another edition of the Two Deep NFL podcast. With us, as always, Jeffri Chadiha from the NFL Network, Eric Eager from Consumer Sports. I'm Soren Petro from Sports Radio 810 WHB, and it's time to talk about the NFL draft from a different perspective, though. A man who's made the call. How hard is it to figure out which one of the quarterbacks is the right quarterback? How hard is it to put that draft together? Get it all done. A guy who did it for 3 different franchises, Bill Polian, one of the best NFL executives in the history of the National Football League, joins us next here on the Two Deep NFL podcast.
You're listening to the Two Deep Podcast, the most complete analysis of the National Football League, breaking down the NFL like no one else can. Two Deep is hosted by Jeffri Chadiha, Eric Eager, and Soren Petro. Jeffri Chadiha is a senior columnist and on-air personality for the NFL Network and NFL.com. Eric Eager is the vice president of research and development for Consumer Sports. Soren Petro is the afternoon drive host of the program on Sports Radio 810 WHB in Kansas City. Two Deep is proudly brought to you by Gann Asphalt and Concrete, Kansas City's nationally recognized full-service paving and pavement maintenance contractor, making parking lot problems disappear since 1994. Free consultations, no commissions, in-house crews, and every project comes with a written warranty. Find them online at GannAsphalt.com or call 816-484-3338. Gann Asphalt and Concrete, one contractor, all things parking lot. Now, here are the hosts of the Two Deep Football Podcast, Jeffri Chadiha, Eric Eager, and Soren Petro.
Thank you, Curtis. Bill Polian started his career as an executive with the Kansas City Chiefs. I didn't know that. This is if Wikipedia's right. I'm going with his bio there. Through the Montreal Alouettes, Winnipeg Blue Bombers, the Chicago Blitz. I'm a huge USFL fan. I love that stop right there. Of course, the Buffalo Bills, GM with the Bills, Carolina Panthers, Indianapolis Colts, also added the title of team president. Jeff, you want to do the honors for bringing on one of the best executives the NFL's ever seen?
Yeah, I mean, as you just said, he wrote the book, or one of the authors of the books on how to run a pro franchise. Phenomenal career, Hall of Fame career. Worked with him briefly at ESPN. I've always enjoyed talking to him for different stories. Always educated me in some way. So I'm grateful he's taken the time to be with us today. So thank you for being here, Bill. It's a great honor to have you on the show.
Well, thank you. Let me set the biography straight. I started as a scout with Montreal.
Okay.
I was a pro scout, not an executive with Kansas City.
Okay.
I was fortunate enough, though, to be associated in Montreal with Marv Levy and then again in Kansas City, and had the opportunity to learn and be mentored by Jim Schaaf, a great general manager in Kansas City. Without him, without both those men, I wouldn't be here.
That's fantastic. And I listen, it's a small world. The NFL, and the connections. You mentioned Marv Levy, one of the greats. Marv was like you, CFL. He was the head coach at CFL, NFL, and USFL, right? He was the blitz, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, how about it? What do your juices get flowing this time of year when we roll around to the draft? And do you get on the edge of your seat, get nervous, get sweaty palms when you see all this coming down?
I don't get nervous anymore, and I didn't really get very nervous. Except with individual picks, when I was actually doing it. When you do so much work that, and you've got so much information at your fingertips, that the nerves really don't come into play. And we spent, I don't know if other teams do this, but we spent a week, this final week before the draft, essentially rehearsing everything that would happen, up to and including who was on the phones, taking calls, returning calls, all those kinds of things, to make sure that there were no glitches. And there'll be one or two along the way, but you can handle it. And so there aren't a lot of nerves. The only nerves crop up usually when you make a trade, because if you make a trade, especially if you go down, you have to have 3 guys there that you're willing to take, because the odds are pretty good that 2 of the 3 will be gone when it gets to your pick. So that's the only time that nerves ever enter into it.
Well, Bill, I want to ask you, because just looking at the first pick in this draft, and you've been in that position, obviously, in Indianapolis with Peyton Manning and Andrew Luck. I know they were pretty strong character guys with dads who'd been quarterbacks. But you look at the Chicago Bears and what they're going through, and you think about what you went through making that pick. What's the hardest thing to evaluate about a quarterback taken with that slot?
Well, the hardest thing is the mega part of it. Is he going to be successful? But if you do it correctly, you delve so deeply into the guy in every phase, and I'll get to that in a second, that in the end, if you look at the data objectively, and if you're comparing one to another, in this case, there's three guys probably at the top that the Bears are comparing about. You'll come to the right decision. In the Bears case, it's interesting. I helped out in their coaching and GM search, and George McCaskey, the owner, made it clear that the jury was out on Fields. The new group would come in and make that decision, and having made that decision, that would then dictate how they went. But in the interim period, while Fields was going through his growth process and they were evaluating, their charge was to build a really good running game, a really good offensive line, and go as far as they can in building a really good defense. So if and when Fields remained, or if a new quarterback came in, he was going to inherit a pretty good team. And that's exactly what they've done. They've followed that plan to a T. And so I don't have any doubt that they'll do that same detailed and focused work in choosing the quarterback. Now, with any player, but specifically with a quarterback, you're evaluating four things. One, the measurables. That's easy to find because you get it at the combine, you get it at the individual workout. Unfortunately, by the way, the league office has gotten away, and we're not as functional as we used to be at the combine. We don't get the triangle drill. We don't get, it's not as good as it used to be, but the clubs are resourceful. They get the data. Secondly, you want to know through testing, through interviewing, through on the chalkboard process and film review with the player. Does he understand his position? Can he read defenses? How quickly does he identify them? All of the mental part of it is critically important. You get the medical, thank goodness. The combine is still great at that. You get the medical. And as long as it stays in Indianapolis, that will continue. Moving it out of Indianapolis, in my view, would be a mistake. But I'm biased too. So, but you do get the medical, and then finally, the so-called personality, makeup, character, whatever phrase you want to use. Coach Levy called it football temperament, which I think is really a great way to describe it. You're not hiring this guy to be a choir boy or be ambassador to England or something. He's going to be a quarterback. So let's don't make him into something he doesn't have to be. And then you put that all together and objectively compare all the data. You've got all of the medical, emotional, mental stuff. And then you look at production. That's a deep dive, and it has to be done, and it has to be detailed, and it involves not only the general manager and the head coach and the position coach and the coordinator, but scouts, the security department, the medical department, the people that deal with personality testing. So all of that comes together, and then ultimately you make a decision. But if you don't do that work, if you don't break it down as minutely as I've described, then you can make a mistake. If you go about something emotionally, you can make a mistake. If you go about it rationally, the odds are pretty good that you're not going to make a mistake.
And so how do you eliminate the noise? Because Caleb Williams last year seemed to be the no-brainer. Now Jaden Daniels and Drake May, you hear names popping up in the Chicago conversation. But I remember Ryan Leaf and Peyton Manning were a lot closer than people remember now. And so how did you eliminate that noise of, maybe Ryan Leaf could be better?
I did very few things by fiat. during my career, it was always teamwork because that's what Coach Levy taught me. But I did rule by fiat with the noise. It's not coming in. We don't listen to it. We don't read it. We don't get involved with it. Mr. Irsay would frequently have visitors in the draft room on draft day. And so they would want to hear the television set. So I just took our brain trust and left and went to an office next door. And when we walked in the room, say 10 or 20 picks away from our pick, I'd say, turn the television off. No noise. Don't want to hear it. Won't listen to it. We don't read it. We don't pay any attention to it. And our personnel people, Dom Manili, Tom Telesco, Chris Polian, did very few interviews leading up to the draft. We kept our own counsel because there's no reason. It's competitive. There's no reason to tell the world what you're doing. You're telling your competitors what you're doing. So everything was low key, but the noise was not allowed in. Period.
When you think of the team that a quarterback goes into, right? There are examples of guys, Peyton Manning, Andrew Luck, Trevor Lawrence, for example, recently, who have come to teams that were not as well endowed with players as the one Caleb Williams is going to go into. Do you think that, for example, a team like Chicago that you just described, I think very eloquently, how they've gone through the process of building through, getting DJ Moore, getting Keenan Allen, Montez Sweat, putting an offensive line in place. Is that ever in consideration when you think about the kind of quarterback that you're going to put into the fold, or is that, are there different quarterbacks that you think that are more impervious to the kind of surroundings that they have, or not?
No, I think it's much more the former. You're picking the guy that you think can do the best job. How quickly he comes will be dependent upon who's around him, particularly the offensive line and the offensive line coach. In Peyton's case, my predecessor, Bill Tobin, had done a great job of adding quality players to the team. Tarek Glenn was the left tackle. Marvin Harrison was a wide receiver. Kenny Dilger was a tight end. The running back was Marshall Faulk, a Hall of Famer. Teddy Marchibroda and Bill Tobin had done a great job. So Peyton was stepping in to a group that was unfinished. There was still a lot of work to do, but there were some really key players there. And he still threw 28 interceptions as a rookie. So you start with the premise that every rookie's going to struggle. Now compare that to Bryce Young last year in Carolina. First pick in the draft. Same situation. C.J. Stroud and he were choice A or B. They chose, Carolina chose their guy for all the right reasons. Absolutely. I mean, he's stellar in every respect except height. But he played behind one of the worst offensive lines in football. So he was sacked close to 60 times. That's not sustainable. And obviously the Panthers have done a good job adding to the offensive line. But it doesn't take away from the kind of quarterback that Bryce Young is. He just had a very rocky first year. Unsustainable, of course, over time, but they're rectifying it.
Bill, I want to ask you about a pick you made in 2002, I think it was, with the 11th pick. I remember standing around a scout in Kansas City, and I said, I'm a Syracuse guy, and I said, hey, how about my guy Dwight Freeney? And the guy had a dip in, and he looks down, he spits on the ground, goes, too short, and turns and walks away. I was like, oh, okay. Now the Chiefs would go on to take Ryan Sims at number 6. That didn't pan out. You at number 11 decided Dwight Freeney was not too short. What was the conversation like? I mean, to find a Hall of Famer there, he obviously had some knocks against him, but he was a brilliant player in college. I'm sure there are examples of guys that were great in college that they don't translate because they aren't big enough. How difficult was that selection? And were you surprised that he was sitting there?
Oh no, and we weren't surprised about the heat we got for taking him. It was not a popular choice
right
at the time in Indianapolis. Nor was Peyton, by the way. but everybody else wanted it, and the newspaper badly wanted Ryan Leaf. But that's noise. We didn't pay any attention to it. Dwight's choice is a perfect example of how you work hand in glove. The personnel department works hand in glove with the coaching staff to provide a profile that you can work with as scouts. The only thing wrong with Dwight was his height. His weight was fine. His arm length was fine. All of the athleticism was off the charts. He was just short. And so I went to Tony Dungy and I said, can we live with a short guy at this position? And he said, yes, because the way we're going to align him in most situations, it will negate that. His speed will overcome that height deficiency. And his explosion is going to get him to the passer to the point where he's going to be able to make plays and cause sack fumbles and things of that nature. So I don't worry about that. Then we got to, with the scouts and the coaching staff, got right down to the nitty gritty, which was, there was a big defensive tackle there. We needed a 3 technique as well. And by the way, thank you for all the kudos, but I never did find the 3 technique we needed in Indianapolis. That's my fault. Had we found it, we might have had a few more Lombardi trophies. Booger McFarland was at the end of his career when we finally traded for him, and that's what got that Lombardi that's behind me. But the bottom line is that there was a big defensive tackle from Georgia there who was about 6'5" and maybe 310. In those days, that was a big number. He wasn't fast and he wasn't twitchy, but boy, was he powerful. And our scouts really loved him, and some of the coaches really loved him. Our defensive line coach, John Tierling, wasn't as high on him as some others were, but he was a good player nonetheless and was drafted in the first round. And I can't recall his name right now, but he had a good career. And so Tony and I are on the treadmill like 2 days before the draft, side by side. And I said, it's come down to this. What's your feeling? And he said, listen, as long as we're together, don't ever forget this. Given a choice between speed and anything else, I'll take speed all the time. I said, okay, I know what our choice is. So we took Dwight Freeney. Now, neither of us, I think, would say, Tony and I talked just the other day, neither one of us thought that we were picking a Hall of Famer. Only Dwight knew that. But it was the right choice for all the right reasons. And it was a perfect example of both sides of the organization working together to get the right guy.
Bill, you mentioned the combine and the way it's changed. And I'm curious about the whole draft preparation process and the way pro days have gotten bigger in relation to evaluating quarterbacks. Because one thing that I think we've talked about a lot on this show is just how many bombs there have been at quarterback and first round picks over the last few years. You go back to whatever this latest class with Fields and Mac Jones and Trey Lance, and you can keep going back 5 or 6 years. Is it harder to evaluate that position, even though you are spending less when you're drafting the guy nowadays?
It's spending less is a key point, by the way. Thanks for bringing that up. It's harder for this reason. They're paid less. So significantly less. When Peyton came out and we made him the first pick in the draft, he automatically became the highest paid quarterback in the National Football League. That's not true by a factor of 10 these days, maybe a factor of 20. So it's easier to overdraft those guys. And everyone knows, this is one of the truisms that we hear. Everyone knows that you can't win without a really good quarterback. So everybody's looking for one. The people that don't have them are looking for one. So we overdraft them. I mean, there's no reason that some of the people that you talk to would have been drafted anywhere before 20, let's say. In the old days when it cost a fortune to draft that guy in the first round or at the top of the first round. But now that the cost is less, so people are willing to take a chance. We're likely to have 4 quarterbacks go 1, 2, 3, 4 in this draft. That's just a matter of cost and the scarcity and the need for one. And so you're talking about, people are even talking about, I do follow the noise now, by the way, I must admit to that. But because I got to know all 32. When I was drafted for only one, that's all I cared about. But to think that the Giants could have a guy who's paid $40 million a year, and they're thinking about, at least ostensibly thinking about getting in the quarterback business if one fell to them, indicates where that economic equation has come. Having said that, we know statistically, if you measure it, that if 4 or more quarterbacks are taken in the first round, 2 will make it and the rest will fail. All that does is validate what the statistics tell us about the draft in the first round. 40% of first round draft choices are going to fail. It's the nature of the business. We're not clairvoyant, you know. We don't have magic wands. We can't, we can't conjure up stars. We can only do the best we can with what we've got in the position that we're drafting. So all of that spade work, the right person for the right system, et cetera, has to come true in order for it to happen. Now, is it harder to draft quarterbacks? Yes, because the spread offense in college is so different from what we do in the National Football League that there is going to be a huge learning curve, number one. Number two, that you don't know whether the guy can actually develop the skills necessary to be really good in the National Football League. Let me give you one simple example. The running game is still important in the National Football League. And the running game under center leads to the play action passing game. So if you look at Bill Belichick with the young man from Alabama that they took, when they had him under center and they had a good running game and a good play action game, he was fine as a rookie. Then as that diminished and the protection got worse, his situation worsened. So how do you predict that? You don't know. Bryce Young was rarely under center last year in Carolina. Rarely. Caleb Williams, I'm thinking back now, I don't have notes in front of me, but I've rarely seen him under center. Mm-hmm. So they've got to learn how to do that, or else you're going to be a pistol team, which is not ideal. It's really not ideal. So that sounds like to the average fan, so what? It's not so what. It's really important from an X's and O's standpoint. So I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, and I think back to the teams that you were competing with in the early 2000s to win the Super Bowl, right? And their quarterbacks, Matt Hasselbeck, Jake Delhomme, Tom Brady, Trent Green, Tony Romo, those, to your point about the cost of failure in the first round of the NFL draft at quarterback is, oh, whoops, I fail on Sam Darnold, I'm just gonna go get Zach Wilson, or I fail, or I'm just gonna trade all these picks and get Aaron Rodgers. Back in the day, you could, when the Dallas Cowboys were, for whatever reason, didn't want to trade up and go get the first pick. They had Drew Henson, a college baseball player. They had Tony Romo out of Eastern Illinois. They stashed these guys and developed them. And, Kurt Warner, we have history of this league developing good quarterbacks on the end of the bench, playing their first games when they're in their late 20s, Rich Gannon, Brad Johnson, guys like that. And I think one of the sad things in the NFL right now is you don't get that. Carson Wentz just signed. We're a Kansas City-based podcast. Carson Wentz just signed with the Kansas City Chiefs, and there's a very small chance Carson will ever be an NFL starter again. And in the old NFL, Carson Wentz probably would have had another shot to, Chris Chandler was on like 5 teams before he took the Falcons to the Super Bowl and was traded like multiple times. Does that, from an evaluator standpoint, do you get sad about that? Does that make, because I feel like everybody's talking about Spencer Rattler and even Penix and Nix, And I think to myself, I'm like, grow up. They're not going to get a chance to be an NFL quarterback given the economics of this game. And I get sad about that because the former NFL, you were rooting for guys like Jake Delhomme to go to the Super Bowl because they were the diamonds in the rough by people like you being able to pick guys from La Tech to go play NFL quarterback. And I really wish that there was an enterprising NFL franchise that was saying, like, look, the guy that plays gunner on 5 punts a game doesn't matter as much as having a hedge against all of these failed quarterbacks that get taken in round one. And I just do not see these NFL teams doing a great job of that.
Well, I tend to agree with you. I think the exception is Kansas City with Andy and Brett Veach. And what you're talking about starts with drafting, because when you do the drafting, the round that you put the guy in, and again, we talked about quarterbacks being artificially high, but the round that you put him in tells you what you think of him. If he's a first round guy, you're thinking of him as a potential starter. Once he proves, Carson Wentz being a perfect example, once he proves that he's not the Messiah, so to speak, then it's not wise. You may have to discard him on your own team, but if you're a GM and you're looking around the league and you don't have an acceptable backup quarterback, a guy who can win, if he has to play 6 games, win 4, then you better be setting aside cap money and working to get that guy. And we did that, believe it or not, in our last year in Indianapolis. We brought in Kerry Collins, who I had drafted in Carolina.
Yeah.
When Peyton went down, and we were doing fine. Things were humming along, and then Kerry got a concussion, and it essentially ended his career. So when you get 2 injuries at the same position, obviously things almost never work out. But you're absolutely right. The guys that fail as the number one guy, as the guy that's going to take you to the promised land, are always valuable as backups, and you should set aside the money to and make the effort to find one, because you're going to need him. Over 17 or 20 games, you're going to need him. There's no question about it. We played 60 quarterbacks last year in the league, so there's the number.
Yeah. That's a great point. Bill, I wonder, I heard a great story. I've told it on the radio many times. Ron Jaworski told it. I heard Ron Jaworski say this. He was watching practice with the Colts one day, and he noticed that Peyton Manning was getting all the reps. And he went over to Tom Moore and he said, Tom, don't you think you got to give one of the other guys? I think this would have been a time when you didn't have Kerry Collins, right? There was a lesser backup. And he said, don't you think you need to give somebody else, some of the reps? And this is how Ron Jaworski tells it. Tom looked at him and said, Ron, if 18 goes down, we're effed. And we don't practice that. I'm curious, were you part of those discussions? And is that the reality of a salary cap when the quarterback does become the rock star, like Peyton Manning was? Hey, reality, we'd like to spend in a lot of other spots, but it's all on this guy, and we just know we're all in with him.
Well, yes. That was the salary cap dilemma, and that's why I made the point to Eric's point that if I had to do all over again, I would set aside the money. I'd find a way to make it work, to set aside the money for a backup quarterback. And I should have known better, because after all, we had Frank Reich in Buffalo, who at the time he was playing was the best backup quarterback in the National Football League. And we overpaid him long before everybody knew what Frank Reich was.
Steve Berline in Carolina, who was awesome too, by the way.
Exactly right. Yeah. But the salary cap squeezed in order to compete with the Patriots and the Steelers. In that run we were in, we were trying to add people at other positions, and we felt honestly that we had found the right guy in Jim Sorgi, but he had been hurt, and his career was essentially on the downside when Peyton got hurt. So we got caught in one of those binds that ultimately cost us our jobs, unfortunately. And that's a lesson you never forget.
Bill, I want to ask you about franchise building because, again, when you went to Buffalo, they became a Super Bowl caliber team. They went to obviously 4 Super Bowls based on the blueprint you put there. Carolina was an expansion team, made the playoffs pretty quickly, and then obviously what happened with Indianapolis when you got there. What were the secrets you would give to GMs today to tell them about trying to turn franchises around quickly? Because it seems like some teams can do that. Andy Reid did it with Kansas City, but other teams spend years trying to figure that out.
It starts with a plan. Coach Levy always said, plan your work your plan. It starts with a plan. Identify what your needs are within the context of the system that your coach employs. Fill those needs relentlessly, 365 days a year. Don't listen to the naysayers. Don't listen to the outside noise. Identify the needs, find them, fill them, and do it with urgency. And never, here's where the GM comes in. This is, as I said before, this is an absolutely cooperative business. The idea that, everybody asks the question, who has the final say? Ultimately, the coach has the final say, for goodness sake. He's going to coach the team. So, if he wants a specific guy as opposed to another, if the GM likes another guy, you can keep him on the practice squad. You can actually fix that issue. But here's where the GM comes in. If there is a need to fill, then you have to fill it no matter where you are in the season, no matter where you are in your growth process. And that's the time when the GM has to go in and say to the head coach, listen, I know that the assistant coach doesn't want this new guy in the room. We're 5 games into the season. We need a running back who can win in short yardage and goal line on his own in order for us to go on 4th down, in order for us to score in the red zone. And the guy that I found is that guy. And I know the running back coach doesn't want him because he doesn't want to have to train another guy. Coaching personally. This is the reality of things. But this is the guy we need. We got to bring him on now. You don't have to dress him. You don't have to dress him until he's ready to play, until everybody's convinced that he knows what he's doing. But we need to add him to the roster. And that's the point where that sense of urgency, the GM has to convey that sense of urgency. You can't sit there and say, well, okay, we'll let it go another week. You let it go another week, the guy's picked up by somebody else. You have to attack the needs with a tremendous sense of urgency all the time. If you do that, then you're going to speed the process.
Bill, you bring up such a good point. My boss is Thomas Dimitroff. He talks about this all the time about working with his coach and, kind of building out job descriptions and being accountable to the owner when he signs a player and the coach uses him differently than he intended, and how nerve-wracking that can be as a team builder when there's, once the ball leaves your hand, you kind of have no control over it. You obviously, you got to work with some really great coaches and in all of your stops. And then you talked about also, though, being there for the Bears hiring when it was sort of the Trace Armstrong athletes first, with Eberflus and Poles kind of having the same agent and being in a group together. Do you think that nowadays the relationship between general manager, that team builder, and the head coach is stronger? Or do you think that it is more disjointed than it was before? Because I've seen, for example, in Carolina, Matt Rule got the job first and then Fitterer got the job second. It wasn't necessarily as uniform as maybe other places like Chicago, where that you talked about previously, where it does seem like there was a consistent thematic plan to get to right where they are with Caleb Williams at pick number 1, possibly. We don't know exactly. What do you think that relationship, between general manager and coach, has evolved to? And do you think it's in a better place or a worse place league-wide than when you were building teams?
I think it's about the same as it's always been. The great symbiotic relationship between coach and GM and therefore coaching staff and scouting staff is rare. And if you're fortunate enough to have that relationship, then you're almost guaranteed of success. I worked with three guys, Marv Levy, Tony Dungy, obviously, and in Carolina with Dom Capers, where they all had different philosophies, by the way, all different philosophies. We were 3-4 defense in Buffalo. We were 3-4 in Carolina. We were Tampa 2 in Indianapolis. But everybody was on the same page. And the head coach basically said to the assistant coaches, hey, we'll listen to what you have to say. Your deal carries weight, but we're also going to listen to the personnel people. Coach Levy, as always, said it best. He said, when a player is here, we'll listen 90% to the coaches. When a player isn't here, we're going to listen 90% to the scouts. And he carried it through. So when you have that kind of a relationship, I failed to mention Jim Mora and Jim Caldwell, both guys that were highly cooperative as well. When you have that relationship, the job becomes easy. And I don't doubt for 1 minute, and Thomas, I'm sure, would tell you the same thing, that there were coaches on the staff that said, these guys are crazy. What the hell are they bringing this guy in for? Or scouts on the staff say, what the heck are their coaches doing with this guy? He can't play dead in the Western. Well, again, that's internal noise that if you have really great executives and they're on the same page, and by that I'm including the head coach and the coordinators, then you go ahead and say, listen, this is the decision we're going to make. And then once you make it, then you make it work. That's rare. That's rare. And the best teams always have that symbiotic relationship. San Francisco, with John and the coach. You keep naming them. The good teams have that. The bad teams are dysfunctional. That's the essence of it.
Yeah, I just think that's so overlooked in the process of everything. And obviously, with your experience, it seems like the people you've listed off, it's like, well, geez, you had good head coaches with them, good executives. It seems to be a pretty simple thing. And the teams that you've listed off, like you said, San Francisco, and in Kansas City here, we had John Dorsey, who's really good evaluator. John Dorsey's drafts were phenomenal. And then when there was some friction with Andy Reid, Brett Veach has now been here, and Brett Veach and Andy Reid, I feel like, get along and are as thematically consistent with each other as anybody in the NFL. And funny, they're winning Super Bowls. Obviously, having a quarterback there matters, but I do think that Brett Veach's relationship with Andy Reid and their ability to work well together puts them over the top. And you look Jeffrey Lurie and Howie Roseman, and that they've had whenever they've had their issues in Philadelphia, it's always been the relationship with the coach. And when they've had good relationship with the coach, they've had success. And it just seems like a variable that a lot of people leave out when they're analyzing teams.
It's critical. You hit the nail right on the head. That's critical. If you don't have that, the likelihood is you won't succeed.
Bill, I'm curious. You've had so many great picks. Thurman Thomas with the Bills. We mentioned Dwight Freeney, and not always. Jeff brought it up, and I forgot about your own paper. Thought Ryan Leaf was the guy, right? Like some of them controversial. Edgerrin James over Ricky Williams.
Ricky Williams, yeah.
That was one that shocked everybody. Edgerrin James, Hall of Fame. Ricky went on to be a fine running back, but bounced around and didn't have the maybe the smooth career that Edgerrin James had. But I'm curious, is there one that is the one that got away for you? One that is there any pick that you remember, boy, I almost took this guy. We went another direction, and we should have taken that guy, and maybe give us some details on why it didn't, go the direction you wish it had?
I really never worried about the guys we lost, with one exception that I'll share with you here in a second. Because you don't control that totally. You can't control what the other 31 teams do, and sometimes you simply make a mistake on a player. So Norm Pollum, who was my first boss in Buffalo, was a great football philosopher. He said, "Don't look back. There's nothing to be gained by doing that. Learn the lesson, but don't dwell on it. Now, the one that got away is Teddy Bruschi.
Okay.
Dominique and I had scouted Teddy throughout the college season, and then he became the MVP of the East-West Shrine game as a edge rusher, and he was Dwight Freeney before Dwight Freeney. Now, I don't think he was quite as heavy as Dwight, but he was a great outside rusher. And we were a 3-4 team at that time, and the coaching staff thought he was way too short to be an outside rusher. We had a firm conviction on him, but what I said was, look, he's also played some as an inside player. So if he doesn't make it as an outside guy, he certainly will be on the field, and he's the kind of football player we need to have. And he was a sack machine. So we went down. We tried to keep everything secret. We went down to work him out at the absolute last minute. You could work somebody out. We flew down to Phoenix. I think we flew private, but it was all sub rosa. He had a great workout. Dom really liked him. You couldn't help but like him. And then, we're all set to get him. And so we're in a pre-draft meeting, and some ownership people were in there, and we said, we really like this guy, Bruschi. And said, where do you think you can get him? He said, well, we think we can get him in the 3rd round. And not a lot of people know him, and not a lot of people think that he's big enough, but we think he can do it. So lo and behold, we're sitting there and we think we have the world by the tail, and we're gonna get our guy, and a couple of picks in front of him, New England picked him. And that's the only time that I can remember in all the years that I was involved in drafts that I got up and left the room. I was so furious and frustrated. And I told Teddy the story, obviously, when we were at ESPN, but he's the one that got away that I've never gotten over it.
That's awesome.
Good for New England for having picked him.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah,
We never saw it coming.
Yeah. Well, I think the last thing I want to ask you is just, we talked about this a few years ago about franchises that hold on to quarterbacks too long. And I know that you had to go through a transition with Peyton Manning when he had that neck injury, and it was tough to talk to him about moving on and the next era for that franchise. But I look at teams like Pittsburgh with Ben Roethlisberger, how long he was there and what they've gone through since trying to find a quarterback. The Falcons have gone through that with Matt Ryan. The Saints, obviously, with Drew Brees. Derek Carr is there, but still kind of how tough is that, for a franchise to understand when it's time to start looking for the next guy? The Chiefs have done a great job with it, obviously, with Alex Smith and Patrick Mahomes. But how hard is that as a GM to say, all right, it's time to start moving away from a guy who's been here and been popular and has won games?
Well, it's really hard. And I don't think notwithstanding what happened with Peyton in Indianapolis, I don't think it's terribly hard intellectually to say, when a guy's in his 14th year, listen, it's time to start looking for the quarterback of the future. We can't leave. My job is not, the GM's job is not to leave the franchise bereft.
Yeah.
Now, there's a lot of emotion that gets in the way there too. I can only speak for myself, but I know in talking to contemporaries of mine like George Young and Ron Wolf, I mean, they share the same point of view. When you've been with a guy for 8, 10, 12, 14 years, and he's literally shed blood for you and brought you to the mountaintop, and that's a relationship that is never going to change for the rest of your life. And so to say to that person, listen, I just need you to know that the time is coming that we've got to think about your successor. I had this discussion with Peyton as part of a 2-hour discussion that he had when he signed his last contract. Neither of us knew that it was going to be the last year for us. That was, it came out of the blue. In his case, the injury, and then obviously, we lost our jobs. But the fact of the matter is that I did say to him, I want you to know that I've got to start looking. And it may come in this draft, it may come in the next one, who knows? But it's time. I owe that to the franchise. I can't, we can't leave them bereft. And he wasn't thrilled about it. We've been together long enough that I knew he wasn't crazy about it. But he's a very rational person too. And he said, okay, I get it. But I said, as long as you're here, you're the man. Nothing's changing there, but I have to go look. That's my obligation. And I didn't think when we were having that conversation that we would finish badly enough to get a shot at Andrew. But I was thinking in terms of the fact that, there'll be another Andrew coming along at some point that maybe we have to take. Things took a different tack, as they often will in the National Football League. As Bill Parcells said, every day 5 things happen that you didn't anticipate. And we didn't anticipate that we would lose our jobs, and we didn't anticipate that Peyton's season would be as terrible as it was with the injury. And Jim Irsay, by the way, was very sincere in saying we're not going to trade him. That issue was brought up by the media in Indianapolis maybe a year before, and he said we're not trading him under any circumstances. But then Jim was genuinely concerned that Peyton would end up with serious injuries because of the neck condition. Fortunately, he didn't. But Jim was sincere about that. He was concerned about Peyton's health, not necessarily the future of the franchise.
Bill, listen, thanks so much for giving us some of your time. It's always great. Always loved watching you break down the draft and getting a chance here to hear some of the firsthand stories and how to put it together. We're all smarter football people for it. So thanks so much for giving us some of your time today.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Bill.
Yeah, Bill Polian, just absolutely the best, guys, when it comes to breaking that down. How about it? I mean, Ryan Leaf versus Peyton Manning. Jeff, people think that this was just like a no-brainer, and his own paper is telling him, no, you're taking the wrong guy.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. I mean, we remember this. We were old enough to remember. Eric was a little bit young, but we're so long in the tooth. Yeah, but it's crazy, and hear him talk about it. So I loved how he explained his process for it. When he explained the process, you understood how he got to that, because there was a lot of, just like today with Jaden Daniels and Drake May, J.J. McCarthy, there's so much noise. There's so much hype around this position now. And I remember thinking, Ryan Leaf, watching him in the Rose Bowl against Michigan, this guy's like way more personality, way more charisma, more swashbuckling, and he was an idiot in the end. And so to be able to pull that out and understand that Peyton Manning was a safer choice, the better bet, it's cool to hear him tell that story about it.
Yeah, and he did it, like I said, Edgerrin James over Ricky Williams was not the popular choice either, and he did that. Listen, a popular choice for you when it comes to your parking lot. If you manage or own a business, is always Gann Asphalt and Concrete with free consultations, no commissions, in-house crews. Every project, it comes with a written warranty. Gann Asphalt's been making parking lot problems disappear since 1994, 30 years. The best in the business at repairing, fixing, building any kind of parking lot issues. One contractor, all things parking lot. It's Gann Asphalt and Concrete. Find them online at GannAsphalt.com. For Jeffri Chadiha from the NFL Network, Eric Eager from Sumer Sports, I'm Soren Petro saying thank you very much for joining us here on the Two Deep